They thought asking her to play was harmless entertainment, but in less than 3 minutes, that single decision would dismantle everything they believed about talent, status, and worth, and no one in that room would ever forget the moment the invisible woman touched the piano. The grand hall of the Whitmore Foundation glittered under golden chandeliers, a $10 plate charity gala filled with tailored tuxedos, silk gowns, and conversations that floated just above genuine interest, where every laugh sounded practiced and every compliment measured. And at the edge of it all moved Eleanor Hayes, quiet, efficient, carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes as if she had done it her entire life, unnoticed except when someone needed something. Her black uniform pressed but simple, her hair tied back in a low, practical knot, the kind of woman people looked through rather than at, the kind of presence that blended into marble floors and polished walls. Near the center of the room stood the evening star, Daniel Cross, a world-renowned pianist whose name alone could sell out Carnegie Hall, his tailored suit sharp, his confidence sharper, surrounded by donors who hung onto every word as if proximity to him added value to their own existence, his laughter louder than necessary, his tone carrying the subtle edge of someone who had long forgotten what it meant to be questioned. The Steinway grand piano, worth well over $150,000, sat beneath a spotlight like a sacred object, untouched for the moment, waiting for its master, while guests admired it as if admiration alone made them cultured. Eleanor passed by it once, just once, her eyes lingering for a fraction longer than usual, a glance so brief it should have gone unnoticed, but Daniel saw it, and something in that fleeting look amused him, a flicker of curiosity mixed with condescension. "Careful," he called out casually, just loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "That's not a decoration," drawing a ripple of soft laughter, Eleanor pausing politely, offering a small nod as if she had overstepped some invisible boundary, though she had said nothing, done nothing. Yet in rooms like this, silence could still be judged. One of the donors smirked, swirling a glass of wine. "You think she plays?" And Daniel tilted his head, studying her for a moment as if assessing an object rather than a person, then smiled, the kind of smile that invited an audience. "Why don't we find out?" he said, his voice smooth but edged with mockery. And suddenly the energy shifted, conversation slowing, curiosity sharpening. Eleanor standing there with her tray, caught in a moment she had not chosen. "Go ahead," Daniel gestured toward the piano. "Play something for us, just for fun." The words light, harmless on the surface, but the room understood the implication, a test with no expectation of success, a performance meant to entertain before the real performance began, a quiet humiliation disguised as opportunity. A few guests chuckled, others leaned in, phones subtly raised, ready to capture the moment, not out of cruelty perhaps, but out of habit, because moments like these were currency in rooms like this. And Eleanor felt every eye settle onto her, weighing her, defining her before she even moved. And for a second, just a second, she hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the tray, her breath steady but deeper now, as if something old and distant had been stirred awake. Then she set the tray down without a word, the soft clink of glass barely audible, and walked toward the piano, each step measured, unhurried, the room quieting not out of respect, but anticipation, waiting for the inevitable awkwardness, the missed notes, the polite laughter that would follow. Daniel folding his arms with a faint smile, confident in the outcome before it had even begun, and Eleanor sat on the bench, her posture straight but relaxed, her hands hovering just above the keys, not touching yet, as if reacquainting themselves with something long forgotten. And in that suspended moment, before the first note was played, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself was holding its breath. And though no one could explain why, no one moved, no one spoke, because somewhere deep beneath the surface of their assumptions, a quiet certainty began to crack, and they didn't yet know it, but they were about to witness something they had no words for a heartbeat. Nothing happened, her fingers still hovering just above the ivory keys as if the distance between touch and sound carried more weight than the room could bear. And somewhere in the crowd, a man exhaled a quiet chuckle, convinced the moment would collapse into awkward silence. But Eleanor did not look at them, not at Daniel, not at the guests, not at the dozens of eyes waiting for her to fail, her gaze fixed only on the piano. As though everything else had already disappeared, she lowered her hands slowly, deliberately, and pressed the first note, soft, almost fragile, a single tone that drifted into the air like a question rather than a statement, and a few people shifted, unimpressed, their expectations confirmed too quickly. But then came the second note, and the third, forming something subtle, controlled, not rushed, not uncertain, just precise. And Daniel's faint smile remained, though it tightened slightly at the edges, because there was something about the timing, the spacing, the restraint that did not match the narrative he had already written in his mind. Eleanor's shoulders relaxed as her fingers began to move with quiet confidence. Not fast, not yet, but intentional, each note placed exactly where it belonged, and the scattered murmurs in the room began to thin, conversations dissolving one by one as people realized, without fully understanding why, that they were listening more closely than they intended. A woman near the back lowered her glass slowly, her eyes narrowing, while a man who had been checking his phone stopped mid-scroll, the screen dimming in his hand, and Daniel shifted his weight, his arms still crossed, but no longer as relaxed as before, his attention now fixed entirely on the woman he had invited to entertain him. The melody deepened, growing richer, fuller, as Eleanor's left hand joined with quiet authority, building a foundation beneath the delicate right hand line, and the piano responded, not like an object being used, but like an instrument being understood, every resonance intentional, every pause deliberate, and the room felt it, that subtle shift from amusement to curiosity, from curiosity to something closer to unease. Eleanor's breathing remained steady, her expression calm, almost distant, as if she were somewhere else entirely, somewhere far removed from chandeliers and tailored suits and polite judgment. And in that space, her hands no longer hesitated, they flowed, gliding across the keys with a familiarity that could not be faked, could not be improvised. And Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, because now he recognized it. Not the piece itself, but the level of control, the discipline behind it, the kind that took years, decades even, to refine. And the room, once filled with soft laughter and casual arrogance, had begun to fall into a different kind of silence, not empty, but charged, expectant. A guest near the front leaned forward in his chair, elbows resting on his knees, eyes locked on Eleanor's hands, while another guest exchanged a quick glance with her companion, confusion flickering into realization, and still Eleanor played on, her fingers gaining speed now, weaving complexity into the melody, subtle at first, then undeniable, the transitions seamless, the phrasing expressive, and somewhere in the back, a whisper died before it could fully form, because no one wanted to be the one to break whatever this was becoming. Daniel uncrossed his arms slowly, the movement almost unconscious, his posture shifting from casual dominance to something far more alert, his eyes narrowing not in disdain, but in focus, as if he were trying to solve a problem that had just presented itself without warning. And Eleanor, still unaware or perhaps simply uninterested in the audience behind her, leaned slightly into the piano, her hands now moving with a confidence that erased every assumption that had been placed upon her just moments ago. And though no one said it aloud, the same thought passed quietly through the room, growing stronger with every note, that this was no longer a joke, no longer a favor asked of a quiet server, but the beginning of something none of them had prepared to witness. And as the melody began to shift once more, hinting at something far more demanding, far more revealing, the air itself seemed to tighten, as if the room understood before they did that whatever came next would change everything they thought they knew about the woman at the piano. The shift came without warning, not in a sudden burst, but in a quiet, undeniable escalation as Eleanor's fingers accelerated across the keys with a precision that no longer allowed doubt to exist, the melody transforming into something far more intricate, far more demanding, each note layered with intention, each transition seamless in a way that could not be learned casually or mimicked under pressure. And the room felt it, that unmistakable tightening in the chest that comes when something extraordinary begins to unfold right in front of you, something that demands attention whether you are ready or not. A man near the center leaned back slowly, his confident posture fading into stillness, while a woman beside him pressed her lips together, her earlier amusement replaced by something closer to disbelief, and one by one, the subtle sounds that had filled the room before, the clinking glasses, the low murmurs, the shifting of chairs, all disappeared, replaced by a silence so complete it felt almost intentional, as if the entire space had agreed without words to surrender to what was happening. Eleanor did not rush. She did not perform for them. She simply played, her hands now moving with an effortless command that spoke of years, of discipline, of something deeply ingrained rather than recently acquired. Her left hand driving powerful, controlled patterns while her right hand danced across the higher register with clarity and emotion that cut through the air, and Daniel felt it in that moment. A quiet but undeniable realization settling in, because this was not skill that could be dismissed, not technique that could be explained away. This was mastery, and it stood in direct contradiction to everything he had assumed just minutes earlier. His posture straightened, his attention narrowing, his mind racing through possibilities, trying to place her, to categorize her, to understand how someone he had reduced to a passing amusement could command the instrument with such authority, and yet there was no immediate answer. Only the growing certainty that he had miscalculated in a way that could not be undone. Eleanor's expression remained calm, almost detached, as if the room behind her no longer existed, her focus entirely on the music, on the flow of sound that now surged with intensity, rising and falling with controlled force, each phrase building upon the last with deliberate momentum. And the guests felt themselves pulled into it, not as observers anymore, but as participants in something they could not fully explain, their earlier judgments dissolving into something far more uncomfortable, a quiet awareness of how quickly they had been willing to define someone based on nothing at all. A man who had laughed earlier now stood frozen, his glass untouched in his hand, while another guest lowered her gaze briefly, as if reconsidering something deeper than the performance itself. And still Eleanor continued, her hands now moving faster, stronger, the music expanding into a full, commanding presence that filled every corner of the hall, echoing off marble and glass, leaving no space untouched. Daniel took a step closer without realizing it, drawn forward by a need to see more clearly, to confirm what his ears were already telling him. And as he watched her hands, the precision became undeniable, the articulation flawless, the phrasing not just correct but expressive in a way that only came from someone who understood not just how to play, but why. And that was when it shifted again, not just for him, but for everyone, the realization no longer forming quietly, but arriving fully, that this woman, this quiet figure they had overlooked, was not stepping into their world for a moment of amusement. She had been part of a different world entirely, one they could not see, one they had failed to recognize. The music climbed higher, more intense, pushing towards something inevitable, something final, and the tension in the room rose with it, every person aware now that they were no longer witnessing a simple performance, but a revelation. And as Eleanor's hands moved with unwavering confidence toward what felt like the edge of something extraordinary, the silence deepened once more, heavier now, charged with the weight of realization, because no one in that room could deny it any longer. They had not invited a distraction to the piano. They had awakened something far greater than themselves, and whatever came next would not just end the music, it would redefine everything that had come before it. The final movement did not arrive with chaos, but with control so absolute it felt almost unreal. Eleanor's hands moving faster now, yet never losing precision. Every note landing exactly where it belonged. The music swelling into something powerful, something undeniable, filling the grand hall with a force that no one could ignore. And for the first time that evening, the audience was not observing. They were experiencing, drawn into the performance whether they wanted to be or not. Daniel stood just a few feet away now, no longer the center of attention, no longer the one in control. His earlier confidence replaced by a focused stillness, his eyes locked onto her hands as if searching for a flaw that simply was not there, and the realization settled deeper with every passing second. This was not luck, not hidden potential. This was someone who had lived in this world, someone who understood the language of music at a level he recognized immediately, but could not easily accept. The guests felt it too, that quiet shift in power, subtle but absolute. The kind that did not need to be announced because it was already understood. A woman who had been invisible just moments ago now commanding the entire room without saying a single word, and no one dared interrupt, no one dared move. Because to break the silence now would feel like a mistake they could not take back. Eleanor leaned slightly forward, her expression unchanged, calm, steady, as if none of this surprised her, as if the music had always been there waiting, and all she had done was allow it to return. Her fingers now weaving complexity into the final passages, the kind of technical brilliance that separated professionals from masters, and somewhere in the room, a quiet breath escaped, not from boredom, but from awe. The intensity built higher, climbing towards something inevitable, the notes cascading in perfect sequence, rising and falling with emotional weight that could not be ignored. And Daniel felt something unfamiliar, not doubt, but respect, reluctant and unspoken, because he understood now that what he was witnessing could not be dismissed or diminished. It demanded recognition whether he offered it willingly or not. The final sequence approached, and the room seemed to tighten once more. Every person aware that they were standing at the edge of something they had not expected to witness, something that would leave a mark long after the sound disappeared. And Eleanor did not rush it. She controlled it, stretching the moment just enough to make every note matter, every pause deliberate, until at last, her hands slowed, guiding the music toward its conclusion with a quiet authority that felt almost effortless. And then, the final chord, clear, resonant, echoing through the hall like a statement that needed no explanation, and just like that, it was over. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence that followed heavier than anything before it. Because this was no longer the silence of expectation. It was the silence of realization, of people confronting the gap between what they believed and what they had just experienced. And Eleanor remained seated for a brief moment, her hands resting lightly above the keys, her posture unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. Slowly, she stood, smoothing her uniform with a small, almost automatic gesture, and for the first time since she began, she turned slightly, not toward the crowd, not toward the applause that had not yet come, but just enough to acknowledge the space she was leaving behind, her eyes calm, unreadable, and Daniel opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came, because in that moment, he understood something far more difficult than being wrong. He understood that he had underestimated someone completely, and there was no performance, no reputation, no status that could rewrite what had just happened. Eleanor stepped away from the piano without waiting, without seeking approval, and as she began to walk back toward the edges of the room, the same place she had come from, the silence followed her, stretching, deepening, until finally, somewhere behind her, a single pair of hands began to clap, hesitant at first, then stronger, and the sound spread, growing, filling the room with applause that arrived too late to change anything, because the truth had already been revealed, and Eleanor did not turn back. She simply continued walking, as if she had only done what she always could, leaving behind a room full of people who would never look at someone ordinary. The same way again the applause followed her like a wave that arrived too late to matter, rising behind her with urgency, with admiration, with a desperate need to correct what had already been done. But Eleanor did not slow down, did not turn, her steps steady as she moved back toward the quiet edges of the room where she had always existed, where she had always been expected to remain. And yet nothing about that space felt the same anymore. The guests who had once overlooked her now watched her every movement, their eyes no longer casual or dismissive, but searching, questioning, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they understood with the one who had just commanded a concert-level performance on a $150,000 piano without hesitation, without preparation, without introduction. A man stepped slightly into her path as if to speak, then hesitated, unsure of how to address her now, unsure of what tone to use, and he stepped aside again, allowing her to pass, because something had shifted that could not be undone. Something that made even the most confident voices uncertain. Daniel remained where he stood near the piano, the applause surrounding him but no longer belonging to him. His name no longer the center of attention, his presence now secondary to the memory of what had just happened, and for a long moment, he did not move, his eyes fixed on the instrument as if it might offer an explanation, but it remained silent, reflecting only the truth he could not ignore. Finally, he exhaled slowly and turned, his gaze following Eleanor across the room, and there was no trace of mockery left, only recognition, and something heavier, something closer to humility, though he did not yet know what to do with it. "Miss Hayes," he called out, his voice not loud, but clear enough to cut through the fading applause. And for the first time since she stood up from the piano, Eleanor paused. The room quieted again, not completely, but enough for the moment to take shape, for every eye to return to her, waiting, watching, because this was no longer about a performance. This was about what came after, about how a person who had been underestimated chose to respond when the truth was undeniable. Eleanor turned slowly, her expression calm, unchanged, as if the attention held no weight for her, as if she had already moved beyond the moment everyone else was still trying to process. And Daniel took a step closer, not with authority, not with arrogance, but with something far more careful, far more measured. "That was," he began, then stopped, because the words he had used so easily before no longer felt appropriate, no longer felt sufficient. And for perhaps the first time in a very long time, he found himself without the language to define what he had just witnessed. Eleanor waited, not impatiently, not expectantly, simply present, allowing the silence to exist without needing to fill it. And in that silence, the imbalance between them became clear, not of status, but of understanding. "You are extraordinary," Daniel said finally, the words quieter now, stripped of performance, and a subtle shift passed through the room. Because this was not praise offered lightly, not from someone like him. And yet it still felt incomplete, still felt like it missed something essential. Eleanor held his gaze for a brief moment, her eyes steady, not confrontational, not proud, simply certain, and then she spoke, her voice soft but clear enough for those closest to hear. "I used to play." And the simplicity of it landed with more weight than any explanation could have carried. No history, no justification, no attempt to elevate the moment, just a statement that left space for everything they did not know, everything they had failed to ask, everything they had assumed. Daniel blinked, processing the words, understanding that whatever story he had imagined was only a fraction of the truth, and that the rest remained entirely out of his reach. Eleanor gave a small nod, not of acknowledgement, but of closure, as if the moment had already passed for her. And then she turned again, continuing her walk toward the service corridor, her presence fading back into the background she had once occupied so easily. But the room she left behind was no longer the same. Conversations resumed slowly, but differently now, quieter, more thoughtful, as if each person carried a piece of the realization that had settled over them. And Daniel remained standing near the piano, his reflection faint in its polished surface, a reminder not of what he had achieved, but of what he had overlooked. And though the evening would continue, the gala would proceed as planned, nothing would fully erase what had happened, because in a room built on appearances, one quiet woman had revealed something far more enduring, and the silence she left behind said more than applause ever could. The service corridor was quieter, dimmer, the polished noise of the ballroom fading into a distant hum as Eleanor stepped through the narrow doorway, the soft echo of her shoes against the tiled floor replacing the applause that still lingered behind her. And for a moment, it was as if none of it had happened at all, as if she had simply returned to the version of the night that everyone had expected for her. Invisible, unnoticed, necessary but unremarkable, and yet something within her had shifted, not because of the performance, not because of the reaction, but because of what had been uncovered, something she had not allowed herself to face in years. She paused briefly near a stainless steel counter, her hand resting lightly against its cool surface, her breathing steady but deeper now, her reflection faint in the metal, and in that reflection, there was no stage, no audience, no expectations, only the quiet truth she had carried for so long, the part of her that had once filled concert halls, that had once been introduced under bright lights and long applause, the part she had chosen to leave behind when life demanded something different, something simpler, something quieter, A distant burst of applause rose again from the ballroom, louder this time, as if the guests were trying to hold on to what they had just witnessed, to make sense of it through repetition. But here, in the stillness of the corridor, it felt distant, almost irrelevant, and Eleanor closed her eyes for just a second, allowing the last note she had played to settle fully in her mind, not as a performance, but as a memory, something reclaimed rather than displayed. Footsteps approached from behind, measured but slightly hurried, and she did not need to turn to know who it was. The rhythm alone carried enough intention, enough uncertainty, and Daniel stopped a few feet away, the silence between them stretching for a moment before he spoke. His voice lower now, stripped of the projection it carried in the ballroom. "Why did you stop?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, the kind that did not come easily to someone used to having answers. Eleanor opened her eyes slowly and turned, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and there was no tension in her expression, no defensiveness, only a calm understanding that made his question feel almost expected. "Because I chose to," she replied simply, her voice even, and Daniel frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in confusion, as if the answer, though clear, had not yet fully reached him. "You could be on that stage," he said, gesturing faintly back toward the ballroom, toward the piano, toward everything that represented recognition and status. "You should be." And the certainty in his tone returned for a brief moment, not arrogance this time, but conviction, the kind that came from someone who understood the value of what he had witnessed. Eleanor listened, her posture unchanged, her hands resting loosely at her sides, and then she shook her head slightly, not dismissing him, but correcting something deeper, something he had not yet seen. "I was," she said, the words, quiet but firm, and the meaning behind them settled slowly, not as a refusal, but as a statement of fact, of something already lived, already completed. Daniel studied her face, searching for more, for context, for a story that would make sense of everything. But she did not offer it. She did not explain, because she did not need to, and in that moment, he realized that the gap between what he knew and what she had lived was not something he could close with a conversation, not tonight, perhaps not ever. The distant music from the ballroom resumed, softer now, as if the evening was attempting to return to its original rhythm. But it felt different, altered in a way that could not be undone, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing, not because he had found clarity, but because he had accepted its absence. "They will talk about this," he said after a moment, his voice quieter still. "About you." And Eleanor gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, not out of pride, but recognition of how those rooms worked, how stories were shaped and reshaped to fit expectations. And then she shook her head again, gently this time. "No," she said, "they will talk about what they saw." And there was a difference, a subtle but important one, because what they had seen was not her, not fully, only a moment, a fragment. And as she stepped past him, continuing down the corridor, that distinction remained behind, lingering in the silence he could not quite explain, because for the first time in a long time, he understood that not everything extraordinary was meant to be owned, defined, or even fully understood. Some things simply existed, quietly, until the moment they chose to be. Soon the corridor grew quieter with every step Eleanor took, the distant music from the ballroom fading into something softer, something almost irrelevant, and yet the weight of what had happened lingered, not around her, but behind her, clinging to the people who had witnessed it, trying to reshape their understanding in real time. And inside the ballroom, that process had already begun. Guests who once spoke with effortless confidence now lowered their voices, their conversations no longer about status or influence, but about the woman who had stepped out of nowhere and redefined the entire evening. Their words careful, almost hesitant, as if acknowledging her too boldly might expose how quickly they had dismissed her before. Near the piano, Daniel remained still, his hand resting lightly against its polished surface, the reflection staring back at him no longer matching the certainty he had carried into the room. And for the first time in years, he found himself replaying a moment not to critique it, but to understand it, each note Eleanor had played echoing in his memory with a clarity that refused to fade, each transition reminding him of something he recognized deeply but had not expected to encounter here. Not like this, not from her. A donor approached him cautiously, offering a polite smile. That was quite unexpected, the man said, choosing his words carefully, and Daniel nodded once, not offering the usual commentary, not reclaiming the narrative, because he could not this time, and the man lingered for a moment before stepping away, sensing that something in Daniel's silence was different, something that did not invite conversation. Across the room, small groups formed and dissolved, each trying to interpret the same moment from a different angle, some calling it a hidden talent, others speculating about her past, her training, her story, but none of them fully grasping the simplicity of what she had said, that she used to play, as if that single sentence held more truth than any explanation they could construct. The gala attempted to continue, servers moving again, music resuming, but the rhythm had changed, the energy no longer centered on the expected performances, no longer anchored by the hierarchy that had defined the room at the start of the night, because something had disrupted it, something that could not be easily restored. Daniel finally stepped away from the piano, his movements slower now, more deliberate, and as he walked through the room, he noticed something he had not before, the way people looked at one another, not with the same certainty, not with the same immediate judgment, but with a flicker of hesitation, a quiet question forming beneath their usual confidence. And he understood then that the impact of what had happened extended far beyond the performance itself. It had shifted something subtle but real, something that would follow them long after the night ended. In the corridor, Eleanor reached the small break area reserved for staff, the fluorescent lights casting a softer, more honest glow over the space, and she picked up a folded towel from the counter, her hands steady as she resumed the quiet tasks that had defined her evening before everything changed, as if returning to them was not a step backward, but a continuation of something she had always chosen. Another staff member glanced at her briefly, then looked again, recognition flickering in his eyes, not from status, but from witnessing what the others had. And yet he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not reduce it, and Eleanor offered a small nod before continuing, her focus shifting back to the rhythm she knew well, the one that required no audience, no validation, only presence. Back in the ballroom, Daniel paused near the entrance to the corridor, not stepping through this time, but standing just at the edge, the line between two worlds clear in a way it had never been before, and he realized that what separated them was not opportunity or talent, but choice, and that realization settled deeper than any applause ever could. He turned slowly, returning to the crowd, to the expectations waiting for him, but something had changed in the way he carried himself, something quieter, more aware, as if the certainty he once relied on had been replaced by something far more valuable. And though the night would continue, and the music would play, and the conversations would resume, the memory of a quiet woman at a piano, choosing to reveal just enough and nothing more, would remain, not as a spectacle, but as a question no one in that room could fully answer. By the time the evening began to settle into its final hours, the grand hall no longer felt like the same room it had been just a few hours earlier. The polished confidence that once defined every conversation now replaced with something quieter, more measured, as if each guest carried a lingering awareness that could not be dismissed or ignored. And though the music had resumed, and another performer now sat at the piano, the contrast was impossible to escape, because no matter how technically perfect the performance was, it felt rehearsed, expected, safe, while what they had witnessed before had been something entirely different, something that had not asked for approval and therefore could not be compared. Daniel stood near the back now, no longer surrounded by eager listeners, his presence still recognized but no longer commanding the same attention, and he did not try to reclaim it, because he understood that whatever authority he had carried into the night had been quietly dismantled in a matter of minutes, not by confrontation, but by truth, and that kind of shift could not be undone with words. He watched the pianist on stage, noting every detail, every precise movement, every technically flawless passage, and yet there was a distance he could not ignore, a subtle absence of something he had heard so clearly before, something that could not be taught or rehearsed, and he realized then that what Eleanor had played was not just skill, it was presence, something rooted in experience, something that could not be separated from the person herself. Across the room, Guests continued to speak in hushed tones, some attempting to return to familiar topics, others still circling back to the same moment, the same question: who was she? How had they not known? How had they missed it? But no answer fully satisfied. Because the truth was not hidden, it had simply not been valued. And that realization lingered in ways that made even the most confident individuals reconsider their own instincts. In the service corridor, Eleanor finished folding the last of the linens, her movements steady, unhurried, the rhythm of her work grounding her in a way the performance never needed to. And as she placed the stack neatly onto the shelf, she paused for a brief moment, her hand resting lightly on the fabric, as if acknowledging something unspoken, not regret, not longing, but recognition, a quiet acceptance of both what she had been and what she had chosen to become. The door to the ballroom opened briefly, letting in a soft spill of music and light, and for a second, she could hear the new performance more clearly, the familiar structure, the practiced execution, and she listened, not with comparison, not with judgment, but with understanding, because she knew that world, she had lived in it, and she had walked away from it not out of failure, but out of choice. The door closed again, and the corridor returned to its quiet stillness, and Eleanor picked up her coat from the chair near the exit, slipping it on with the same calm presence she had carried all evening, as if the extraordinary moment that had unfolded behind her was simply another part of a life she no longer needed to explain. Back in the ballroom, Daniel turned once more toward the corridor, his gaze lingering there as if expecting something, though he knew she would not return, and in that moment, he understood something he had never fully considered before, that not all brilliance sought recognition, not all mastery required an audience, and that some of the most extraordinary things existed quietly, revealed only when circumstances forced them into view. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization settling deeper than any applause he had ever received, and as he turned back to the room, to the conversations, to the expectations that still surrounded him, he carried something different with him now, not doubt, but awareness, the kind that changes how a person sees everything that comes after. And somewhere beyond the polished walls and glowing chandeliers, Eleanor stepped out into the cool night air, the city lights stretching out before her, unchanged, indifferent to what had just taken place inside. And she walked forward without hesitation, without looking back, because for her, the moment had never been about proving anything. It had simply been a reminder, quiet and complete, that what truly defines a person does not disappear. It waits, patiently, until the world is ready to listen. The city outside carried on without pause, headlights gliding across wet pavement, distant, sirens blending into the rhythm of a night that did not care about what had just unfolded behind those marble walls. And Eleanor walked steadily along the sidewalk, her coat pulled slightly closer against the cool air, her steps unhurried, as if she had nowhere urgent to be and nothing left to prove. And yet something about the way she moved carried a quiet certainty, the kind that does not seek validation because it has already been earned. Behind her, inside the grand hall, the final conversations of the evening drifted toward their conclusion, but the tone had changed in a way no one could fully articulate, because what they had witnessed was not just a performance, it was a disruption, a moment that forced them to confront the gap between what they valued and what they overlooked. And long after the last guest would leave, that question would remain, lingering in quiet corners of memory where it could not be ignored. Daniel stood alone near the exit now, his gaze resting briefly on the closed doors that led out into the night, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel the need to follow, because he understood that whatever he might say would not add to what had already been said without words. And instead, he turned his attention inward, replaying the moment not as a comparison, but as a lesson, something far more difficult to accept and far more valuable to carry forward. A staff member passed by him, offering a polite nod, and Daniel returned it without hesitation, a small gesture that might have gone unnoticed on any other night, but now carried a different weight, because awareness, once gained, changes even the simplest interactions. And as he stepped back into the room, he no longer saw it as a stage to be controlled, but as a space filled with individuals whose stories he could not assume, whose abilities he could not measure at a glance. Eleanor reached the corner where the streetlights softened into a quieter stretch of road, the noise of the main avenue fading behind her, and she paused for just a moment, not to look back, but to breathe, to allow the stillness to settle fully. And in that stillness, there was no applause, no judgment, no expectation, only the quiet presence of who she was, unchanged by what had happened, yet gently reminded of something she had once set aside. Her fingers moved slightly against the fabric of her coat, a small, unconscious motion, as if recalling the weight of the keys beneath them, the way the music had returned not as something forced, but as something that had always been there, waiting, patient, unchanged by time or distance, and she allowed herself a faint smile, not of triumph, but of recognition, because the moment had not created anything new. It had simply revealed what had never truly left. Somewhere behind her, the doors of the hall opened again, releasing another wave of laughter and conversation into the night. But it did not reach her, not in the same way, because she had already stepped beyond it, beyond the need for those spaces to define her, beyond the expectation that recognition must come from others to be real. Daniel, now speaking quietly with a small group near the center of the room, found himself choosing his words differently, listening more than he spoke. And when someone mentioned the performance again, he did not attempt to explain it, did not reduce it to something manageable. He simply nodded, allowing the silence that followed to hold its own meaning. Because some moments lose their power when overdefined, and this was not one of them. Eleanor resumed walking,